Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to accelerate your S/4HANA transformation and eliminate risk. So before we do get started, I'll just run you briefly through the agenda for today. So I'll provide a brief introduction to our sponsor, Revelation Software Concepts, and then we will move straight into the webinar. Three main areas we're going to be covering in today's topic. One is talking about the transition process itself, and then highlighting some of the associated challenges. We'll then talk about a RICEF approach to transitioning a custom code during a transition, and then how we can go about adopting automation to accelerate the transition process. Now, we can also accept questions, and we'll be happy to have a Q&A session towards the end. So in your panel on the right-hand side, you have a place where you can type in some questions. They'll come through and I'll see them. Don't leave it too late, because sometimes it might take a minute or two for them to appear. Generally, it's fairly quick, but if yours is important and it gets up a bit late, we might miss it. Now, if we do miss them, we'll certainly be able to respond later via email or directly if that's what you'd like us to do. So let's move forward and get underway then. So today's seminar is brought to you by Revelation Software Concepts, and my name is Rick Porter. I'm the Vice President of Business Development with Revelation Software Concepts, and I'll be today's presenter. So the company has been developing and delivering change management automation for SAP IT teams since 1999. It was a pioneer then, and it's an innovator now, as we'll see a little later in the webinar. Our software solutions, Rev-Trac and Rev-Trac Insights, have been designed to accelerate SAP IT teams towards achieving their required outcomes, specifically the ability to deliver higher volumes of change at faster rates with improved quality, so the business customers can react quickly to market and regulatory changes with confidence. Outcomes that will certainly cost effectively help accelerate your S/4HANA transition plan. So as I mentioned, happy to take questions, so please use the questions area, and we'll be wrapping these together with our Q&A towards the end. So we have a bit to cover, so I'll keep moving through. So the clock is ticking, and I'm sure everyone's aware of this. It's pretty much the number one trending topic we see around in quite a few areas. The time for the SAP's current ECC business suite to be fully maintained by SAP is coming to an end. There is a deadline. Currently it's 2025, and given the number of customers that are clearly not going to make that deadline, there is some talk about SAP extending that deadline, but so far there's been no evidence of that happening, so I wouldn't count on it really as a rule. With around 6 years to go, there's about 50% who it seems haven't started that journey yet, although most of those that we talk to are either in the planning process or evaluating how they're going to go about it. There don't seem to be too many that aren't going there, but we have heard of several that are not going to do that anytime soon. So interesting, according to a 2017 SAP Insider article, the journey is around a 7 to 8 year process. So if that's correct and you haven't started yet, you're certainly not going to make the 2025 deadline, that's for sure. But most companies are looking at how they do that, and there of course is a number of ways forward into doing this. The jury still seems to be out on the best way forward, according to a number of recent surveys among customers. There is a reasonable spread, depending who you talk to, as who's going to do what. There are a number of descriptors, but the greenfield, brownfield, bluefield descriptors seem to be the three generic ones that most people are settling on. Now, some call it a lift and shift, others call it a transition or a landscape transformation. There's a number of different ways of going about it, but basically it's either a brand new from scratch, converting the current system completely, or utilizing some of the new functionality combined with some of the existing functionality that you have today. So a number of different ways forward. And of course, there's the on-premise, private cloud, public cloud deployment decision in the mix as well. But for us, our customers seem to be going down the brownfield or bluefield phased transition approach, with a couple of our customers implementing greenfield, but these have been with either a new acquisition or with a smaller business unit, and generally the purpose behind that was to get their feet wet, so when they did their full ECC transformation, they had some in-house experience around that as well. But we've designed this webinar around the more likely brownfield bluefield approach, wherein a large amount of existing ECC code will be lifted and shifted onto S4. But before we get started, let's get an idea of where you are at. So I have a question for you here, and that is, what are your S4HANA transition plans? Are you already started, already there? Are you in the process of evaluating? Is it going to be 1 to 2 years before you do it, or 3 to 5, or you actually have no plans and you'll be doing this sometime after 2025? So feel free, I'll give you a few minutes just to pop that in there, and then I'll close it and you'll be able to see where we're up to on that. So I've had a couple in there, so not everyone's responding, so I'll pop the response up anyway for you. So it didn't come up, sorry, there we go. Okay, so there we can see we do have it's either evaluating or in 3 to 5 years, so reasonably short-term ideas in that particular case as well. So thank you for that. So let's now move on to our next segment, where we're going to talk a little bit about the transition process itself. So during the system conversion, now I think everyone's probably fully aware that S4HANA is a different version of SAP ECC than what we've had before, and so just moving, it's not a simple upgrade. And so during that conversion, there is an amount of custom ABAP code that will be needed to be adapted to function effectively. And this is mostly based on the fact that it's running on top of a different structured database. And so the way the code's written currently in your ECC business suite may not be accessing that database in the correct manner, and so simply won't function. So the code will need to be adapted. Now, not everything will need to be adapted. Some will and some won't, but this is a process that you need to go through as well. Now, there's a number of different things to look out for in the process. So those objects that are likely to transition easily are probably those where the entire processes are built in your Z space, so it doesn't interact too much with the database, it's fairly well enclosed. That could almost be lifted and shifted and run as is today. Also custom processes that leverage standard SAP objects that haven't had significant modification in the new S4HANA system, and also custom objects that are standalone or invoked by customer transactions as well. So these are less likely to require adaptation than others. The more complex ones are those that heavily leverage SAP objects that have actually changed in S4HANA, and of course those that leverage objects that no longer exist in the S4HANA system either. So how does one go from the ECC today to a fully functional S4HANA? Now, there's becoming more and more information available around these. Of course, the process has been documented and put together for quite some time, but just in case there are several here today who haven't seen that or are still evaluating and working out what to do next and so on, the process is basically a 6-step process. The first one is to monitor the existing applications for existing code use. One of the benefits of, or published benefits of, moving from ECC to S4HANA is that it's time to reevaluate your processes and reevaluate what you're actually doing to decide whether you want to continue doing that in the new S/4HANA system or whether you'd like to do it in a different way. So SAP suggests that a long-term monitoring for 12 months or more really be done to provide an extensive data set around that. And there's a couple of SAP tools that are recommended to use to log those processes so you can tell. The next step then is to identify that which is to be transitioned and then that which is going to simply be left behind or not reused as well. Of course, all of that that's going to be transitioned needs then to be checked for compatibility with the S/4HANA system to make sure it operates effectively and works well. That code then needs to be corrected and tested, and then once it's tested, moved into a regression system so that code can be tuned for performance. And once it's all tuned for performance, then that piece of code is ready to use. Now you'll notice here that we're talking in terms of code or programs or objects. So it's a very, very granular, detailed process. SAP does have a number of tools which are within Solution Manager and inside SAP to assist in this process. My role today isn't to go into detail in and around those. These are things that you'll be using in the background to ensure that you're able to maintain an effective program of transitioning your code from one system to the other. The transition does come with challenges, and so I want to highlight some of these because this then becomes the nub of what we're talking about today, and that is one needs to keep track of all the code that's going to be transitioned. So what is it, where is it, how does it relate together? Keeping dependent code together, there is not much point checking a piece of code for compatibility if it actually calls other code that hasn't been checked for compatibility. So we need to ensure that all the code checks have been completed before a full transition is completed. And then of course, managing the inevitable iterative process. One could imagine that if we're moving a range of different objects from a dev system into a QA system, there's going to be quite a bit of traffic going backwards and forwards. So being able to maintain that iterative process, we've checked it for compatibility. It's not compatible. We write some program and put a transport in there for a correction. It still doesn't quite do what you want to, so we need to do that again. Now that could be a 2, 3, 4, 5 iteration process. So managing that is going to be quite tricky. Of course, then managing the code version deployment sequence and then enforcing the transition approval process. If one has a good solid process in place that's enforced and followed, one's less likely to run into trouble. I think the main point here is that if these aren't managed well, this will slow down your transformation because you'll run into a whole lot of problems towards the back end when it just doesn't all mesh together the way that it's actually meant to as well. So we talk about managing change slightly differently in the scenario in that we'll manage change at a requirement level, so a much higher level, not so much the granular level. Yes, all the granular work needs to be done. That's true, you can't avoid that, but how we manage that and how we keep it together is a different matter. So individual object compatibility, as I mentioned earlier, is not really relevant unless the entire requirement and all the necessary objects are compatible together. So managing the transition at the requirement level will ensure that dependent objects are grouped together. The entire requirement needs to be tested before deployment, and so it's not much point managing them a piece at a time. So managing the transition at a requirements level will accelerate the transition process as well. So I have another question for you now, just a little around those challenges and whether or not you are in fact experiencing those challenges. So take a look here and just let us know, are you encountering these challenges in a significant way, somewhat, very little, or not transitioning yet? So about 3/4 of you were transitioning at the moment, and so I seem to have a, so I've popped up the wrong question here, but never mind, we'll go with this one. So this is really around testing and what kind of automation you're going to be implementing as well. So good to see most of you looking at change in transport management. So we've got the right audience here. I'll close and share this anyway. So here's where we're at too. So we actually find that generally speaking, this survey is in line with those we've run recently as well, and that automated testing is certainly a key component of a transition program, or even an SAP DevOps program, really, with automated change control coming a very close second, or sometimes third as well, or even first. So now this audience clearly is a little skewed, because you're interested in how we do this and how we automate this anyway. So I'll close that and we'll move on to the next segment. So we'll talk about utilising a RepTrak requirements approach to managing an S/4HANA transition. Now, many of you will know what the RepTrak requirements approach is, but just in case we don't, RepTrak is just simply a method of categorizing requirements under these particular six particular types of areas here. So it's either a workflow, so we'll manage the entire workflow, we'll manage reports, interfaces, conversions, enhancements, and forms, thus the RepTrak model as well. So we're proposing that we manage this transition utilizing requirements, so managing all the objects together that relate to each one of these. So if we take a look at a process that we might follow to do this, now keep in mind these are all example flows and processes. You may have something quite different that you follow, or if in the process of evaluating, this might be very useful for you in designing your own approach to do it as well. So if we transition using this RepTrak approach, we can see that the first step, of course, is to monitor and analyze everything, so we know what we're going to transition, what we're not. Identify which customized applications and extensions we're going to transition. And then we've got to build that list of requirements. So rather than build a list of objects, we're suggesting we build a list of RepTrak requirements to be considered. And within this will be the list of objects that are going to need to be moved across as well. We then need to check each requirement as a unit of work for S/4HANA capability. Of course, within that unit of work, some objects might already be compatible, but others might need to be corrected, and so that code will be corrected until we have the code within that RepTrak is ready to transition. And so we'll then move that into the S/4HANA system. Now there's two schools of thought around this. One school of thought is that you lift and shift all of the code that you're going to transition into an S/4HANA system, and then check your compatibility afterwards. Others, it's a matter of running some tests beforehand, and when you've actually got that worked out, you can then make your changes utilizing advice from SAP tools, and then move that into your S/4HANA systems. Of course, once we've got that into the S/4HANA system, then it needs to be tuned for performance to make sure it's running effectively, and then that code or that RepTrak is now ready and it's available for transitioning to a production system or for productive use. And once there's enough RepTrak in there, or that particular module has been completed, then that will be used as well. So on that point, many SAP customers we're looking at seem to be doing a phased transition approach. So they'll be moving a module across at a time, and then they'll be running ECC and S/4HANA in parallel for a period of time. And that whole transition process could take anywhere between 5 to 10 years, depending on the resources available and the speed in which they hope to make those changes. Now, some customers we see actually look at this as a really good way to change entirely the way they're doing things, and so really looking at it in an entirely new way. So, but what we want to look at next is how we automate this process to overcome some of those challenges that we mentioned earlier, and also to ensure a better outcome overall. So let's take a look, and we'll introduce Rev-Trac. Now, I noticed a number of you on the webinar today have already quite familiar with Rev-Trac, being existing users of Rev-Trac, but there are a number of you there who have not used Rev-Trac before. So in a nutshell, Rev-Trac provides a very powerful SAP change management automation platform that can enable you to improve your velocity, improve your system stability, and significantly reduce the costs of managing your SAP changes and your transformation process. It enforces and automates all the tasks and processes that go around managing all of this as we put together. It's the underlying technology of what I'm going to go through now, and although I have a number of screenshots to take you through to really demonstrate the process, to give you a bit of a look and feel of how this might work within Rev-Trac. Look, it's not a software demo, so if you are interested in that, look, let us know, and we'll certainly be able to arrange that for you. That's for sure. So let's take a look firstly at an example process flow. So here is a flow of taking a RICEF from the very beginning right the way through to the end of the process. So within Rev-Trac, we'll create a number of status steps that a transition change needs to go through. So for simplicity, a Rev-Trac request will be completed for each RICEF. We will call that a group of changes or a unit of work, and we then need to find a way to be able to check those objects for compatibility. Now, within the SAP tools, one can just check all of the objects that have been identified. You'll know which objects are related to that RICEF, so you can search for those and check those and understand which are compatible and which are not. And so we'll check the RICEF objects for compatibility. Of course, it's highly likely one or more of those may need modification. Then those modifications will be completed. Now, that may be an iterative process, and I'll show you how RepTrak manages that shortly. Once all the objects are compatible, they'll then be approved. That whole RICEF will then be approved for deployment to S/4HANA QA system, for example. Then they'll go through a tuning process. It will be tested as tuned. That will be approved, and then once those RICEFs can then be allocated to a sprint, they can be allocated to a release or to a wave, and then approved really for deployment to the pre-production system or to the production system, whatever method you're going to use to build your S/4HANA system ready for productive use when we get to that particular point. So here's an example of a RepTrak. It's a blank RepTrak request. So we give this a title. Generally, that would be around the RICEF. We're going to be creating RICEF number 3241 in a moment. That's going to be some SD changes for S/4HANA. This was put together a little while ago. So this is actually created to represent that RICEF. It will automatically manage the process around that. It will document all the technical details and manage those, things like the transports and the objects. It'll house any documentation that goes along with this, and then display the approvals and the audit trail from creation through to productive use. And the record will be there for later reference if a problem or issue arises in production later on and we need to look at some root cause analysis. One can very easily find everything that was done around that particular RICEF. So the RICEF might have just one transport, or it may have many transports. So in this example, we can see that our Rev-Trac request has 2 transports and 2 objects. So it's a relatively simple change that we can manage quite easily. Now you'll see at the top there's a process flow going from where the green tick is at the moment on the left right through to a complete process. So inside Rev-Trac will look something like this, or process flow. So initially we're going to deploy the object to S/4HANA. That can be done automatically straight out of the ECC system onto the S/4HANA system. Now this can be done by simply cloning or copying those transports into your dev system. Next status is it's in development, which means then that developers are working on the compatibility of that code, making sure that it works properly, interacts with the database and other objects effectively, and making sure that any objects that it relates to are also done there as well. Now, once the Rev-Trac is completed, it will do that automatically for you. So this is a highly flexible process. This is a relatively simple 8-step process, but you'll modify this to suit your needs quite simply and quickly. So for example, Gun configured this particular workflow for me in less than 40 minutes, and also created several changes around that too. So it's not a huge effort to be able to put this together. It's about as simple as you can get, really. So now we need to check for compatibility. So at a particular point in the process, there will be an approval required that will state, yes, this particular RICEF, the objects within it are compatible. They've passed our compatibility test. We're happy with that. But in this particular case, this was rejected. We can see here that the status was in fact rejected. So the status was rejected. It failed its code review, and so when this happens, it then goes back to in development. Developer is alerted. It may very well be the developer that actually signed off this or rejected it, but maybe a tester signed on this and rejected it. But it now goes back to in development. Once it's in development, a new transport will be added. So in this case, here we can see that the correction transport was added. So now we've got 3 transports, we've got 3 objects here. So now it'll be tested again, and assuming it passes the test, it will then be approved for migration through to the QA system. Within Rev-Trac, there's a great deal of visibility. So here we have the proof of location that it's actually been picked up and it's been imported into the system. So as a group, so we can be very confident that all 3 objects, the 2 originals plus the 1 correction, are sitting inside our QA system. Now, within these transports, for example, you can have 1 or many objects. Some customers choose to have a significant granularity, so they might have a number of different transports created for a number of different objects. Others, of course, will package possibly all the RICEF objects into the 1 transport. So that's entirely up to you and how you do that. Whichever way you choose to do that, Rev-Trac will manage that effectively for you as you move through. So now our RICEF components are in our QA system, and they're ready for tuning. In Rev-Trac will automatically deploy the transports from the target, from the source system into the target system, and so you can be assured that everything that is been collected together on this one Rev-Trac request has been effectively moved into the QA system. So when you begin to do your testing, you know that everything that's supposed to be there is there. Now, of course, Rev-Trac can't pick up things that you don't attach to it, so you need to make sure that you do attach to the Rev-Trac request all the correct transports and all the correct objects for that particular RICEF. Now, there may be a time when it's in your best interests to be able to create several Rev-Trac requests to rectify or to manage a RICEF. It might be a particularly large RICEF, perhaps a significant workflow that requires interaction with a number of different objects in a number of different areas, and so therefore you may create several RepTrak transports to manage that RICEF. Now they can be linked together with what we call dependencies, and that then dependent rules can be in place so that certain things can't happen until all three have passed particular steps in the process. And so then that can give you confidence that all of your objects and transports related to that RICEF have been managed together, even though they're managed on separate RepTrak requests to create the whole unit. Now, in this particular case, the performance tuning failed, and so this was, once again, it was rejected. Now, each time you do sign off an approval or as a rejection in RepTrak, you can see that there's an audit trail. This was rejected by Gun Ui. It was rejected at 13:34 on the 9th of September, on the 11th of September. So a full audit trail exists in here, so we can go back and understand what's been happening as well. Here we can also see that the movement from dev to QA was auto migrated, and we can see when that happened as well. So that happened on the at 11:29. So Gun clearly jumped onto that quite quickly and move that through. Now this is also very useful if someone has actually approved it as suitable to move to the next phase, and there's very little time between when it landed in the system to when it was approved to move forward. So one might say, well, look, you really didn't test that properly. You only had it on your desk for a minute or two. So there are ways and means to utilize the RepTrak audit trail to hold people accountable for what they're doing along the process as well. Because as this moves along, pressure's going to mount as we get closer to go live dates, and shortcuts can be taken, but RepTrak's been designed to minimize the opportunity to take those shortcuts to keep your system safe and to prevent trouble further down the track as well. Now in this case, once again, a correction transport has been added. So now we see we've now got 4 transports against this RICEF, and four programs, or 4 versions of programs. And so we now know that we can move them through into QA, and we can then re-import that back into QA. So when we move this through, we now know once again that these 4 transports related to this particular RICEF are all kept together. They're all managed as a unit of work. Nothing's being left behind. We know that we're going to move them through. So this contains the 2 original transports plus the 2 correction transports. And so now we're ready to retune this program. And once that retuning has been completed, we've now been able to approve that through into the next phase. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of how RepTrak might be utilized to manage your transition process. There is an infinite number of ways to configure RepTrak to do this, and one would expect that you would have sat there and you would have figured out what your process is. So rather than hammer your predetermined process into a tool that's been provided to you, RepTrak will actually enable you to mirror exactly the process that you would like to follow, and you can tune that process as you go along quite quickly and quite easily without having to raise a ruckus to get that done either. So it's very simple, very easy to use, it's very intuitive, and will help you manage that process effectively. So the value then of automating a RICEF requirement is as follows. So firstly, hopefully we've been able to see that all transition code is tracked. Nothing is moved along without somebody knowing about it. The dependent code is all managed as a unit of work. And so I've mentioned there's 2 ways to do that. One is to attach all the objects to do with that particular RICEF or that unit of work onto the one RepTrak request, or we can divide that up into several RepTrak requests and then keep them together using RepTrak dependency management. The entire requirement is then compatibility checked, so your compatibility testing is assured. It will not be moving to the next phase without the appropriate approvals, and so you're not ending up with this huge mess of objects that are seemingly unrelated, and you're managing everything at the object level. That's just going to slow things down, and create inevitable problems for you further down the track. And so then the development iteration process is also well managed. So as we saw here, there could be any number of iterations depending on the phase one is at, and we still need to make sure that that's managed well, and there is an audit trail around why it had to iterate in the first place. Code versions are then deployed in sequence, and the agreed transition workflow and approval processes are followed. Many SAP using organizations will contract with a systems integrator or several system integrators to do this work. With Rev-Trac in place, you can be assured that every person working on your system will be following your pre-approved process, that they won't be out there doing something that you're not sure of what's happening. There will be the approvals. In fact, if you want to make sure that people on your team are approving everything before it goes to the next phase, you can do that. Or you can trust those approvals to your systems integration team leaders and so on. But either way, you'll be able to be certain that your process has been followed. And so this degree of automation will accelerate your transition process. To leave it as a manual process will slow you down and will certainly result in some problem issues a little bit later on. Now, a couple of things along the way there, of course, if we've got a very busy program going on, there will be RICEFs that contain similar objects or the same objects. And so we need to be able to manage those in parallel. It's not going to be easy to be able to identify those. So within RepTrak, RepTrak has been designed to facilitate parallel development, but to facilitate it in a way that things are visible for you. So within RepTrak, the parallel development workbench will enable your development team leaders to understand the status of every object that is being managed in parallel. So you might have two separate RICEFs that actually need to encompass the same object. And so we mentioned that we speak about managing RICEFs as units of work. So all those objects will be with the one. So it's quite possible there will be many RepTrak requests containing parallel or the same objects. So this needs to be managed well. The RepTrak Parallel Development Workbench provides the visibility that your leaders will need to be able to manage these effectively. Other things that will occur is that oftentimes your RepTrak request or your RICEF will actually refer to objects that are not within that particular RICEF. It's not possible sometimes to allocate everything into that RICEF, and so we need to understand, are we referring to an object that's either changing or non-existent in our target system? And so the RepTrak Peripheral Object Dependency Check, or PODS we call it, will enable you to be able to do that as well. And of course, many are trying to run an agile development program, and so you're running in sprints. Otherwise, you would be running in waves or releases, and the RepTrak Release Management Workbench will certainly enable you to do that. So in this case, we could imagine that as our RICEF is completed, it can go into the unassigned request area, and then depending on which wave we would like that to belong to. So on the far left-hand side, these are weekly waves, depending on what they might be. This is just an example. We can then move that into that particular release. And at a particular point in time, one may lock that release or wave down, then there will be no more allowed transports or RepTrak requests to be added to that release as well. So this is a fantastic way to manage your sprints, your waves, or your releases, and particularly useful if you're doing a waved approach in releasing S/4HANA for the business to be working with as well. Now, there will be a time too when you will be managing things in parallel, so a phased transition process. So most of those that we speak to will be managing the transition over a period of time, which means that we need to maintain and run a legacy ECC system whilst running the new S/4HANA system at the same time. And so managing dependent changes between both can be challenging, because there will be cases when we do need to make a change inside the business suite and a change within S/4HANA to actually meet a particular business requirement during this interim process. So Rev-Trac will control changes effectively across both landscapes and keep those together. Rev-Trac understands the source of your changes, so it will also know the target of the changes. So you can still manage them together as a unit of work, as a RICEF on the one Rev-Trac request, and keep all things in control. So we'll just wrap and then we'll take questions. So if you've been able to put some questions into the questions area, that would be useful. I'm having some problem with my mouse here, so bear with me. Okay, so let me just check the questions area here. Okay, so no questions yet. So if you've got some questions, please pop them in here, and we'll answer those as we come through and get to that. So, right, so what have we covered? So we've covered really the transition process, where S/4HANA comes from and where it's going to go, and we've briefly covered the associated challenges. Now, those challenges are not unique to an S/4HANA transformation, and I'm sure you're aware of that. You would have bumped into those challenges in a whole range of different scenarios. We've introduced the RICEF approach to transitioning custom code to a greater or lesser degree. You'll find that very useful. And then, of course, we've spoken about adopting automation to hold it all together and to accelerate those transitions. So the outcome that's being offered really is an accelerated transition process to minimize the time required to go from your ECC system to your S/4HANA system. And it's a lengthy process, but if that can be minimized in any way, you can realize the value that you've been promised from S/4HANA earlier rather than later. So what do you do next? Well, there's a couple of things you can do next. You can take a closer look at how your team could effectively automate your SAP change management processes and how automation will help transition that process. You can contact us for a demonstration, or to learn more, we have a couple of case studies from customers who have used Rev-Trac to help with their S/4HANA transformation, and you can read about those as well. So let's move through to taking some questions now. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the section, and I'll get to those. So while they're coming in, often we're asked, does a product like Rev-Trac take a long time to get implemented and up and running? Because you've got a lot of things on your plate. You've got an S/4HANA transformation, and it seems to take up all your time and all your energy. The answer to that is no. Rev-Trac is not a huge project. Yes, you do need to spend a little bit of time understanding your processes, but we provide support to walk you through that process. Once that's done, Rev-Trac can be installed and running for an S/4HANA transformation within a couple of weeks. So within about 2 weeks, you can have Rev-Trac installed in your systems, ready to manage your S/4HANA RICEF transformations. Now, of course, if you've got a very large environment and you want to run Rev-Trac out over the rest of that, that could take a little longer as you begin to implement your various other process flows and teams in and around that as well. But generally, a 3-month project would be the maximum, and that would require one person from our side for several weeks and 1 or 2 people from your side to work on that. And once that's installed, it then becomes, depending on the size of your landscape and the volume of your change, can be very much a part-time position for you to manage that. So no expensive resources required, and you can generally manage Rev-Trac with your in-house people quite effectively as well. Another question we often get asked is how flexible is Rev-Trac, because some alternatives are inflexible. We're requiring you to manage change the way that the vendor suggests you should run and manage change. As mentioned during the webinar, Rev-Trac is extremely flexible. You can manage your processes the way that you want to, and you're able to change those processes and tune them as you go along without a major impact on what you're doing as well. So hopefully that's been helpful for you. There's no other questions been asked today, so hopefully that has covered everything you've wanted to. As mentioned earlier, contact us if you would like some more information about Rev-Trac and how we can help you. Feel free just to contact us to have a chat about how you're doing things as well. We do see a lot of ways that customers do this, and we're there talking to customers about this every day. So if you'd just like to shoot the breeze with one of us to find out what we know, feel free to do that as well. May or may not result in us working together, that's okay. It could be useful anyhow. If you happen to be coming along to Tech Ed, let us know. We can always set up a chat whilst we're there as well too, and learn about a few things together as well. But other than that, that's all for today. The recording of this and the slide deck will be made available, and you'll be able to access that via some links that will come out to you in an email following the webinar. If you'd like to contact us, the contact information will be sent to you as well, and it's also in the deck as well too. So I trust the rest of your day will go well. I do thank you for your time today, and trust you have a good afternoon. So bye for now.